Hello and welcome again to Cultural Caravan. I'm your host, Ed Werner, for this series, in which we're studying the history of Kenosha and Kenosha County. We have just completed the 1840s, or we may say the pioneer stage of Southport, now Kenosha, and this time we're starting off in the 1850s. Southport is gone now. It's been renamed Kenosha. You'll notice in this series that the buildings are taking on more of a permanent nature. I hope you'll enjoy the program. But before we start our program, I'd like to introduce you to the archives at the Kenosha County Historical Society. We're at the Kenosha County Historical Society on the second floor in the archives room. And I'd like to introduce Kate Dallas, who's the archivist here at the Society. Kate?
Thanks, Ed. We welcome researchers, beginning or advanced, to our Society archives. Our archives contain a wide variety of research materials. We have wonderful map collection. We have a fantastic collection of newspapers from Kenosha that date from the early 1840s all the way through the 1940s. So if you're searching for an obituary or local history in that 100-year span, this might be the place for you. We also have in the collection county and city board proceedings. We have diaries and journals, some family histories. So if you're doing genealogy work, we may have your family, or are always happy to add your family to our collection. We also have an extensive photograph collection of over 1,000 images. So when you come to visit us, we have many things that you can use and are happy to be of service.
Kenosha County's first courthouse, the building on the right with cupola, was built in 1850 and demolished in 1885. The building to the left housed the county offices until 1870. Later, it became the police garage. The courthouse was located on the northwest corner of the intersection of Market Street and Chicago Street, 56th Street and 8th Avenue. The building was designed to have the whole staff under one roof except for the registrars and clerks' offices. The building was constructed of brick 40 by 60 feet, 3 stories in height, and surmounted by a dome in the center. The main entrance to the building was by a flight of steps to the second floor. The roof and basement projected from the main building, forming a recess or landing from which pillars ascended to the roof. The basement was for the jail. The second floor was for offices, jury rooms, and the jailer's residence. The third floor was the courthouse. The courthouse, when first built, was believed to have been lighted with candles and sperm oil lamps. Heating was with wood and box stoves. In the jail, the floors were of oak planks 2 or 3 inches thick. The cells were made of thick oak planks. This is the Long Home, about 1850. This old landmark was located on the west side of Church Street and extended south from Park Street, that is 7th Avenue and 57th Street. It was probably Kenosha's first apartment building. It contained 9 apartments, 1 story high with a very low attic. Each apartment was on a lot 88 feet deep with 14 feet of frontage on Church Street. The total frontage on Church Street was 126 feet. The brick building to the left of the Long Home was the Durant and Van Arsdale Foundry. On this building hung Kenosha's fire alarm bell, the rope of which was accessible at all times. The person turning in an alarm of a fire by ringing the bell would receive $1 from the city of Kenosha. The Long Home was replaced in 1910 by brick store buildings. This was Wilmot's oldest house. It was located on the Voke Farm on the Wilmot Silver Lake Road on the east side of the Fox River, north of the Wilmot-Kenosha Road. At the time this photograph was taken, the house was not occupied. It was the general opinion of the old-timers that it was originally built by A.W. Benham, who was the first settler recorded in Wilmot in 1844. The house was built on Mill Street in Wilmot and moved in 1893 to the Volk Brothers Farm to be used as a tenant house. This early day hotel in Kenosha was built by Eli G. Runnels about 1850. It was located on Main Street at the corner of Wisconsin Street, 6th Avenue and 58th Street. It burned in 1860. Eli G. Runnels came to Southport about 1845. At the time, Southport was merely a thriving village. He quickly identified himself with the interests of the place, built the Runnels House, a block of brick stores, the Oddfellows Hall, and other prominent buildings. He opened and kept his hotel, was president of the Kenosha County Bank, bought much land, established farms, and was engaged in many large business enterprises. He traveled twice to New York from Wisconsin with his own horse and carriage, and traversed many of the other states in the same manner. An imposing figure, he had white hair and keen black eyes. His costume was of the gentleman of olden times, a blue dress coat with gilt buttons, frilled shirt bosom, black stock, and polished silk hat made a striking and imposing appearance which attracted attention even in the crowded streets of Chicago, or in the more finished thoroughfares of New York. He died in Kenosha, November 7th, 1890. This was the home of Eli G. Runnels in about 1884. The location of Eli G. Runnels' home was about 2½ miles west of Lake Michigan on the Burlington Road, or Highway 142. The dwelling was known as the House of Seven Gables, and the farm bore the name Willowbrook. This farm was sold to Thomas B. Jeffrey, and in January 1915 became the property of Kenosha County. Willowbrook Sanitarium was built here. This slide of the home of John McCaffrey was photographed in 1931. From the photo, it is evident that an attempt has been made to modernize the building. In 1850, when it was the McCaffrey home, it was probably arranged for one family without the outside stairway. The home became infamous on the morning of July 22, 1850. During that night, the neighbors were aroused by a disturbance in the McCaffrey home. It later developed that John McCaffrey had murdered his wife by drowning her in a cistern. He was arrested and held in jail until the May term of court in 1851. He was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to be hanged. The date of the hanging was set for August 21, 1851. The execution was public, and people came from miles around to witness the event. The ghastly event resulted in this being the last execution in Wisconsin. This McCaffrey house was known for many years as the Haunted House. The Shen Tavern was built in 1851 and burned in the winter of 1902. The Shen Tavern was known throughout the Middle West as a colorful gathering place of politicians and one of the oldest buildings in southern Wisconsin. It also served as a community center for the pioneer residents of Kenosha. The building was erected by Adam Shend in 1850 at the northern limits of the city on the east side of the old wagon road from Chicago to Milwaukee, that is, on 7th Avenue opposite Union Park. When the Civil War broke out, the old tavern gained an even greater reputation and popularity, for the German regiments enlisted in southern Wisconsin made the old tavern a rallying point. Later, Shen Park was established to the north of the tavern building. The park became a center for civic activities and public recreation. In its later years, it was called the Park City Hall. Mrs. Dexter C. Bloomer popularized clothing fashions in the early 1850s. Shown in this slide is Mrs. Bloomer's street dress. It was described as a changeable figured silk, purple and white, extending some 2 inches below the knees, sleeves close as can be worn with perfect ease and comfort, wrought muslin wristlets about 2 inches in width, fitting loosely on the hand side and somewhat resembling at first sight wristlets with ruffles. The straw hat had 4.5-inch rim, lined with white silk and trimmed and tied with a 2.5-inch plain white ribbon. The black silk is trimmed with 4-inch lace and tassels. The trousers, same material as the dress, are gathered closely at the ankle with 1 3/4 inch gauging, with a pretty 2-inch ruffle of the same material below, just covering the top of the Congress gaiter, the tops of which are black prunella and the sides patent leather. The visiting or parlor dress buttons but halfway down and then has one gold or pearl button at the throat, thereby causing the dress to lay open in front in an easy and graceful manner, and revealing a white linen bosom with fine gold studs. Of course, there was a lot of comment about this departure from the fashion then in vogue. A published report of the day states, quote, "Nowadays we hear of nothing but bloomerism and short skirts, and what between the praise and censure of the public and the press in regard to the recent innovation of custom, we are inclined to think that it will be a very long time before the ladies make up their minds to adopt it or to turn their backs on it at once and forever. In America, where the notion originated, a few women who boasted of having more than the ordinary share of mind usually allotted to the gentler part of the creation seemed determined to wear it in spite of opposition and ridicule. Those who think we look queer would do well to look back a few years to the time they wore 10 or 15 pounds of petticoat and bustle around the body and balloons on their arms, and imagine which cut the queerest figure, they or we." The report continued, "Although God created us women, He did not command us to wear long petticoats or to grit our vital organs, but left it to our own good sense to choose the dress best suited to our comfort and our convenience." A minister of the gospel in the town in which Mrs. Bloomer resided, having taken it into his head that the new dress was not a religious one, devoted an entire Sabbath's discourse in informing the female portion of his flock that they must not wear it. His remarks were considered so personal that Mrs. Bloomer replied to them in her journal as follows: "Now we take it upon us to tell this class one and all they are meddling with what is none of their business. The minister aforesaid must be hard run for something to preach about when he goes to dictating to the ladies about the length of their petticoats. We hope his preaching in this case may be like the seed that took no root, and that the ladies of his congregation will not be awed by his frowns." This is the Bristol and Paris Congregational Church in 1853. This church was more familiarly known as the Plank Road Church, as it was located on the Plank Road. In the early days, that road extended west from Kenosha to the Fox River. The church was built in 1853 at a cost of $1,500, and H.A. Newberry was the supervising carpenter. A bell was purchased and put in place in the spring of 1874 at a cost of $275. About 1879, the church was raised on its foundation to make a basement room to use as a dining room and for other church activities. It was in continual use until 1927, when on account of non-support, services were discontinued, and rather than have this old landmark used as a farm building, it was torn down. David Crossett was born in Ogdensburg, New York in 1809. He was a member of the Western Emigration Company and landed at Pike Creek in the late summer or early fall of 1835. He resided here continuously until his death on September 15, 1880. He was a blacksmith, and his shop was on Pearl Street at the corner of Exchange Street. That's at 55th Street and 5th Avenue. For many years he was an active and energetic citizen and filled many offices of honor and trust. This is Mrs. David Crossett, wife of David Crossett. Oxa M. Dodge was born in Oswego, New York. She married David Crossett in Oswego County on October 8, 1829. In this photograph of Mrs. Crossett in 1863, she is wearing a dress typical of that date with a lace shawl, hoop skirt, watch, and chain worn at the belt, and a skirt with broad strips. This is the home of David Crossett, which was built sometime in the 1850s and is described in the Kenosha City Directory of 1858 as being on Exchange Street at the corner of Wisconsin Street. That's at 5th Avenue and 58th Street. Most of the first settlers of Pike Creek settled on the north side of the creek, while Crossett claimed the land on the south side of the creek. This building was erected about 1856 for a church and dedicated as the Williams Congregational Church, and was used as such until about 1868. The first pastor was Reverend John Southward. For approximately 30 years, the Pleasant Prairie Town Board rented the basement for $30 per year. On August 24th, 1889, it was sold for $300 to the town board to be used as a town hall. It was used for that purpose for many years. The building is located in Kenosha County on the old Green Bay Trail, Highway 31. Mrs. Mary Davison Bradford was born on this farm in Paris Township in Kenosha County. It was referred to as the Willis Place. Mary was born January 15, 1856, and she remembered the house in some detail and wrote about it as follows. The house had 2 rooms downstairs, a kitchen and a sitting room, both living rooms. Attached at that time to the kitchen was a lean-to, serving in the summer as a kitchen and in the winter as a storeroom. Off the sitting room was a bed sink, shut off by a curtain. The chamber above was all one room, unfinished. Between the studding, the clapboards showed, and between the rafters could be seen the widely spaced boards and the shingles over them. As soon as possible, the house was made somewhat more habitable. Outside, the clapboards were put upright. They were well battened, and the north end of the open chamber was partitioned off, and the walls of the room thus made were sheeted with matched boards, and a place of great comfort and privacy thus provided for the girls of the family. The photograph shown was taken in 1938 and shows the addition of a brick chimney in the front of the main part of the old house. The lean-to part of the left wing had also been replaced. This is the Summers Town Hall, about 1858. On April 25, 1857, it was voted to build a Summers Town Hall for the amount of $400. The first meeting in a new town hall was held in April of 1859. The building was located at the intersection of Green Bay Road and the Summers Road. The first Frieden's Evangelical Lutheran Church was erected in 1858 on the northeast corner of the intersection of Milwaukee Avenue and Oak Street, now 7th Avenue and 51st Street. It was a small building, 32 feet wide by 40 feet long. 6 years later, an addition was made to provide a classroom for a Christian day school. That building served until 1883. The first missionary came in the year 1850, and in 1853 Pastor Weinman of Racine came and served the congregation until the first resident pastor came. That was Pastor I.D. Huber. On September 1st, 1856, articles of incorporation were filed stating that 16 families of Lutheran faith had organized the Frieden's Evangelical Lutheran Church of Kenosha, Wisconsin. 2 branches have sprung from the mother congregation, and these are St. Luke's Evangelical Lutheran Church, organized in 1914, and Bethany Church, organized later as a branch of St. Luke's. At the time of its organization, services were conducted in the German language. Michael Frank was born in Virgil, New York on December 12, 1804. He married Miss Caroline J. Carpenter on September 19, 1837 at Preble, New York, and 2 years later, in 1839, they moved to Southport. He obtained the title of colonel by being commissioned as colonel of the 4th Wisconsin Militia by Governor Dodge in 1840. Also in 1840, he became associated with C.L. Scholes in the publication of the Southport Telegraph. There were at that time but few newspapers in Wisconsin. The Telegraph, under the editorial management of Frank and Scholes, became very influential in territorial politics. In 1843, Colonel Frank was elected a member of the Territorial Council, holding the office for 2 years and being largely instrumental in the establishment of free public schools in Wisconsin. In 1840, he was president of the village of Southport, and in 1850, when Southport became the city of Kenosha, he was chosen its first mayor. On the adoption of the state constitution in 1848, he was elected a member of the assembly, serving as chairman of the committee codifying the school laws and later on the committee on railroads. He became a member of the board of state university regents, and in 1861, President Lincoln appointed him postmaster at Kenosha, a position he held for 6 years. Colonel Frank was prominently identified with the early territorial and state militia and is often referred to as the father of free schools. He died in Kenosha on December 26, 1894. Mrs. Michael Frank's maiden name was Miss Caroline J. Carpenter. She was born in 1815 and married Colonel Michael Frank on September 19, 1837 in Preble, New York. She came to Southport in October 1839 with her husband Michael. This home of Michael Frank was recorded in the directory of the city of Kenosha of 1858 as being at the corner of West Main and Pearl Streets, that is 13th Avenue and 55th Street. It is not known how long the Franks lived in this house. The First Church of St. John the Baptist, Catholic Parish at Paris in Kenosha County, was built in the year 1859. The Reverend Biter was the spiritual head at that time. 9 years earlier, in 1850, a few settlers organized the parish. They held their services in an old log house about 5 miles distant from the present church. This old building served them until it became possible to erect a church of their own. From the year 1859 until 1870, St. John's Church had shared the priests from Brighton, a distance of about 5 miles west of Paris. The parish continued to grow and finally felt that they should have their own resident priest. A parsonage was erected, whereupon the Reverend J.B. Reindell was the first resident pastor. In the year 1877, Reverend Walter undertook the building of a school and placed the Sisters of St. Francis, whose convent is located near Manitowoc, in charge of the school. In 1912, the parish built a new church at a cost of $25,000. This is the Honorable Charles Durkee, about 1855. Charles Durkee was born in Royalton, Vermont on December 10, 1805. He came to Pike Creek in May of 1836. Sometime in the early 1830s, he married Miss Catherine P. Dana of Cabot, Vermont. However, she died in August of 1837. Mr. Durkee married again in January 1840 to Miss Caroline Lake. His first residence in Pike Creek was a small claim house standing near the center of the city park, now Library Park. His claim covered a considerable portion of the lands in the southern part of the town within the new corporate limits. The title to this land he secured from the government as soon as the lands were offered for sale. The rapid advance of the town during the first year of its settlement was largely attributable to the enterprise and public spirit of Mr. Durkee. Having become a considerable real estate owner, when the town was surveyed into lots, he donated grounds for a fine public park, which today is Library Park, and which was regarded even then as one of the most beautiful in the state. He also donated suitable grounds for a cemetery, which became Greenridge Cemetery. Several times Mr. Durkee was sent to Washington, D.C. in the interest of harbor development for this community. He was a member of the first territorial legislature in 1836 when the state capital was still at Belmont, Wisconsin. In November of 1849, he was elected a member of Congress from the 1st Congressional District, being the first representative in Congress elected as a distinctive anti-slavery man from the Northwest. In November of 1851, he was elected for a second term, making a total of 4 years in Congress. In the years 1849 and 1850, the subject of a World Peace Convention was much discussed in many portions of the country. The idea of universal peace through the intervention of a tribunal of nations very naturally commended itself to Mr. Durkee. Peace on earth, goodwill to men was one of his favorite themes. A peace society was organized about this time in Kenosha County, and at a meeting called for the purpose of considering the propriety of sending a delegate to the proposed peace convention to be held in the city of Paris, France, he was elected. He accordingly proceeded to Paris and was present in the convention as a delegate. Mr. Durkee was elected to the United States Senate in 1855 for the full term of 6 years, making his total term of service in Congress of 10 years. Mr. Durkee was an active member of the Methodist Episcopal Church and also in the organization of what is now Lawrence University of Appleton, Wisconsin. After the expiration of his last term in Congress, he erected a splendid residence on the shore of Lake Michigan, just outside the corporation limits of Kenosha. At that time, the lot on which the edifice was built comprised 10 acres. His health became impaired, and his physician advised him to seek a change of climate. He conveyed his property to trustees, who agreed to pay him a yearly annuity equivalent to a moderate rental of the property during his own and his wife's lifetime, after which the title, without further consideration, would go to an association. This became known as the Female Seminary and later as Kemper Hall. After leaving Kenosha, he took up his residence in Salt Lake City. And on the death of Governor Doty of the Utah Territory in 1865, President Andrew Johnson appointed Mr. Durkee to fill the vacancy of the late governor. In the latter part of 1869, on account of his declining health, his physician advised him to return to his old home in Kenosha. On the 2nd day of January, he took his departure from Salt Lake City. On the trip, he developed pneumonia, and it became necessary for him and his party to stop at Omaha, where he died on Friday, January 14, 1870. The remains were brought to Kenosha. He had died at the age of 64, and when returned to Kenosha, he was buried at the city cemetery, now Green Ridge Cemetery. This is Mrs. Charles Durkee, about 1855. As Miss Caroline Lake, she married Mr. Charles Durkee in January of 1840. She died in February of 1911 at the age of 87 years. The home of Charles Durkee was located on Mechanic Street, later changed to Durkee Avenue and now known as 3rd Avenue. It was located at what was then Eagle Street, now 65th Street. The home was sold to Kemper Hall about 1860 and then became a part of the main building of this Episcopal School for Girls. This part of the school can be recognized by the circle top and circular windows.
This concludes episode 3 of the history of Kenosha, Kenosha County. I hope you enjoyed it and picked up some interesting information. I wonder if you noticed the first apartment house that was in Kenosha. Hard to believe. We'll start the next episode in the 1860s. This is your host, Ed Werner, saying thank you, and I hope you can join us again.